Hi there. I'm in the middle of putting together a presentation on street photography. Now, living in a rather small urban environment, street photography here does not mean the same thing it would mean in some place like New York. But exactly what do I see as street photography, and exactly what am I going to talk about in my presentation? Well, it comes down to this. First of all, too many YouTubers, influencers as they seem to be called these days, seem to have come up with lots of rules that have to be applied in order for it to be street photography. Let's get away from that right away. Let's take a look at some of the pioneers of street photography. Eugene Atget, in his era, which was around the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th, he had a huge camera. He had to come in, set up his tripod, and his shutter speeds were quite long. Therefore, he had to try and find scenes that were reasonably static in order to get views of a Paris that was disappearing at that time. Around the turn of the 20th century, modernization had really come on in full steam, and the result was changes were taking place constantly. He wanted to record what things were before those changes took place. Maybe that was his main goal, but what he ended up doing really is creating some of the first street photography. Now, I could go through many names and lists of many people who have shot primarily candid scenes in public places. However, let's stick to just a few. First of all, there is probably the best known, Henri Cartier-Bresson. Now, his work took him all over the world because basically he was a photojournalist. Photojournalism has a lot in common with street photography because, of course, it is seeking out events and shooting those events. The biggest difference, of course, is that photojournalism, you are trying to tell a specific story about a specific event. Whereas in street photography, your storytelling is more related to the everyday lives of what you see on the street or the few unusual things that you may come across. Anyhow, some of his most famous shots, like for instance the one behind the train station of the man jumping from the ladder across the puddle, many people look at that as one of his greatest works. He actually shot that through a little gap in a fence, and the gap was so small that it was actually smaller than the lens of his camera. The result is that part of the frame was blanked off, so it was cropped. Now, there's one of the rules that the modern YouTuber says you must not do. You must never crop your images. Many, like Elliot Erwitt, some of his most famous pictures, like the picture of the tiny dog by the lady's feet, is actually extremely cropped. The entire picture showed the woman standing next to the tiny dog. So cropping, well, that's not really a point. Crop if you like. Crop if you need to improve your particular composition. Why not? These pictures are for you. And that's the thing about street photography. It is for yourself. It is for you to share with your friends. Maybe you're going to make it a long-term project. Maybe you'll try to put together a book. Maybe you'll do a lot of things. But for the most part, you're just going to have fun with your camera. Go on the street, find something interesting. When we look at some street photographers, some of the, again, influencers will insist that it must be black and white. Well, Henri Cartier-Bresson shot black and white, mainly because at the beginning that was pretty much all that was available to him that could do what he needed it to do. When color did become in vogue many years later, he saw it as rather vulgar because he thought black and white did a much better job of showing what he wanted to show in his images. But that's one man's opinion. There are other photographers who also shot black and white because they did their own developing and printing. Cartier-Bresson never did his developing and printing. He always passed it on to somebody else. As he put it, he was a hunter, not a cook. So anyhow, along comes a few people like Saul Leiter, who starts shooting in color for his own work for himself. His commercial work was mostly black and white because that was still what was accepted in the 1950s when Leiter first started getting into this. But his images suddenly brought color into the whole thing. Others, like for instance, if we take a look at someone like Joel Meyerowitz. Joel Meyerowitz started off shooting black and white because Meyerowitz was inspired by Robert Frank. However, pretty soon he realized that with color, he could capture something that was missing from the black and white images. The result is that he switched to color. At one point, breaking all of the rules, he shows up with an 8x10 Dierdorf camera on the streets of New York, sets himself up with his huge tripod, and asks people if he can take their portraits. Strangers on the street. Now somebody will say, well, how's that street photography? Well, it is street portraiture. And again, breaks one of the other rules. It's not candid, is it? Then again, there are no rules. So I think the main thing I want to put in my presentation is the fact that there aren't any rules. And the least important thing in street photography is gear. For instance, most people will shoot their street photography with one of these, a smartphone. I like simple cameras. Right now this is being videoed on a Sony a6300 with a 23mm f1.4 lens. That would be a nice setup for street photography because it's the equivalent of about a 35mm lens. And 35mm lenses give you a fair amount of context. It's wide enough to include enough background so you'll know where you are and what's going on, like me, for instance, in this room. On the street, it's a very good one to use, a very good focal length. Many people prefer a longer, a 50mm equivalent, which of course on something like this APS-C camera would be about a 35mm camera, lens, sorry. Some cameras are designed specifically for that, like for instance, a fixed lens camera like the Fujifilm X100 series uses a 23mm lens because the creators of that camera realized that that was the most popular focal length for people doing travel pictures and pictures on the street. I also shoot Micro Four Thirds, and strangely enough, this, which is the first Micro Four Thirds camera from Olympus, their absolute first model, this thing, slow as it is, with one of their first lenses, the 17mm f2.8, is an ideal little package for street photography. Now some would say, what do you mean, it's only 12 megapixels? But remember, this is personal work. I'm not likely to want to print anything larger than 8x10. 12 megapixels is plenty for a very nice 8x10 print. If I want to go a little further, my 16 megapixel camera here, slightly longer lens. This is a 19mm, which means it's equivalent to a 38mm on full frame, whereas the last camera was equivalent to 34mm on full frame. This is a nice little Sigma Art lens. It's an f2.8, very sharp. And the camera it's attached to is an OMD EM5 Mark II. So, again, a tiny little package, very easy to carry, very discreet. A little more professional looking because people see the hump on top and they may think that. But actually the chrome bodies, despite the fact that they may attract more attention, are seen as amateur. So you're less likely to be spotted and pegged as a professional as you are shooting on the street. Those are just my preferences. You may want to go out with a zoom. You may want to go out with something in the 24 to 70 range that you can actually zoom in and change your framing. That's entirely up to you. There is no rule, and that's the thing about this. There are no rules. Guys, that's what my presentation is primarily going to be about, the lack of rules. It's going to be about how to go, not how to do street photography. You had to figure that out for yourself. But it's to point out the fact that don't be persuaded into some idealistic view of street photography from somebody who basically is just a YouTuber. They're not really a professional photographer. They are simply using photography as a basis for running a YouTube channel, much as I do. And that's why I'm not giving advice. I'm simply saying, don't take all that other advice. Go have fun. Take a camera, any camera. Like I said, this one here is what I'll be taking most of the time. Go out on the street. Look around. Whenever you see something you haven't seen before, take a picture of it. You don't need to set, super high frame rates and fire off 50 shots at everything you see. Instead, give it some thought. Think about it. Enjoy the experience. And you may be surprised that some of the images you get end up being pretty darn good. Well, guys, this, as I said, is just a preamble, really, to my presentation, which will be on street photography for my local camera club. That presentation hopefully goes well. You never know. But anyhow, give it some thought. If you want to try street photography, remember, it doesn't mean you have to go find the busiest city and work on the street. Street photography to me means anything that's out in public spaces, shooting evidence at least of human beings. It could be a plowed field. A plowed field shows, yes, there were human beings there. It could be a barnyard. It could be almost anything. It's not going to be a landscape with mountains and valleys and so on. That's not street photography. But it might be a country road. It might be one person walking through a forest path. It could be anything where the hand of man has been at play here. All right, folks, I'm talking too much now. I'm rambling on. I hope everybody had a good Christmas. I hope that your new year is starting off better than the last one did. Not necessarily the case in some places. And hopefully you and yours are well. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means come back and see some others. And of course, you can always subscribe to this channel if you enjoy what you see. Well, bye for now.